When you think of a medieval princess, you probably picture cold stone walls and dark corridors, maybe a drafty castle with no comfort, no warmth, and nothing much to do except wait for someone to decide her future. But that image is almost entirely wrong. A medieval princess woke each morning to the sound of chapel bells drifting across a walled garden. She spent her days surrounded by women she trusted, working with her hands, tending herbs, reading by candlelight, and sitting down to meals flavored with saffron and rosewater. Her life had a rhythm to it, a beauty that history rarely talks about. And once you see what her day actually looked like, you might be surprised by how much of it feels familiar. Picture a castle in the early hours, sometime around the 13th or 14th century. The sky outside the narrow windows is still violet. The fire in the bedchamber has burned low overnight, but the room is not cold. The bed is layered with wool blankets and linen sheets, and heavy tapestries hang along the stone walls, holding the warmth inside. A princess did not sleep alone. Her closest ladies in waiting shared the chamber, and they would have been the first faces she saw each morning. Getting dressed was not something she did quietly by herself. It was a ritual, and it was shared. Her ladies helped her into each layer of clothing, starting with a soft linen shift worn against the skin, then a fitted kirtle, and over that a gown of dyed wool or silk, depending on the season. If it was winter, the gown might be lined with fur. If the occasion called for it, she would wear embroidered sleeves and a jeweled belt at the waist. In the later medieval period, silver thread, seed pearls, and colored embroidery became increasingly elaborate, and a princess's clothing was a visible signal of her family's wealth and standing. But for her, in that quiet room at dawn, it was simply the start of another day, and the gentle hands helping her dress belonged to women who knew her well. The first place she went each morning was the chapel. Nearly every royal household had a private chapel within the castle walls, and prayer was the foundation of a princess's daily life. The day moved according to the canonical hours, a cycle of prayer times that monks and nuns followed strictly, but that devout laypeople like a princess would observe in a gentler form. Prime came at 6 in the morning, terce at 9, sext at noon, and so on through the afternoon and evening, until compline closed the day. She may have carried with her a book of hours, one of the most personal objects a woman of rank could own. These were small, portable prayer books, often exquisitely decorated with painted miniatures of saints, flowers, and scenes from scripture. The pages were trimmed with gold leaf. The covers might be bound in soft leather or wrapped in velvet. Many were commissioned as gifts, and some survive today in museum collections, their colors still vivid after 600 years. For a princess, this book was not just devotional, it was intimate, it was hers. After chapel, the morning opened into a more practical rhythm. One of the most fascinating spaces in a medieval castle was the still room. This was a dedicated workspace, usually near the kitchens, where herbal remedies, cordials, rosewater, and preserves were prepared. And in many noble households, the woman of the house oversaw it directly. The still room connected to the herb garden, where lavender, sage, rosemary, comfrey, chamomile, and thyme grew in neat rows along stone paths. These were not decorative gardens. They were working ones. Every plant had a purpose. Lavender was dried and tucked into linen chests. Rosemary was steeped into washes. Chamomile was brewed into teas for sleeplessness and stomach ailments. Sage was used for sore throats. Comfrey, known as knitbone, was crushed into poultices for sprains and swelling. The knowledge behind these remedies was rarely written down in the early medieval period. Instead, it passed from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter, through spoken instruction and hands-on practice. It was a quiet, living tradition, and women were its primary keepers. Christine de Pizan, a writer at the French court in the late 1300s, described the daily duties of a princess in remarkable detail. In her 1405 book, The Treasure of the City of Ladies, she outlined a life built around responsibility, not leisure. A princess was expected to manage the household with the same authority and attention a lord would give his estate. She carried a ring of keys, the symbol of that authority, granting her access to storerooms, treasuries, and pantries. She directed servants. She oversaw the kitchens. She kept accounts. Christine described a woman whose mornings moved from prayer to governance to charity, and whose afternoons gave way to the quieter, more personal work of needlecraft, reading, and music. By mid-morning, the castle would have been fully awake, and around 10 o'clock, sometimes as late as noon, the main meal of the day was served. In a wealthy household, dinner was an event. The great hall was set with long wooden tables, and the food was carried in from the kitchens by a line of servants. Before anyone ate, shallow basins of scented water and linen towels were passed around for hand washing. Because forks were rare and food was cut with a knife and eaten with the fingers. The meal itself could be generous. Roasted meats, savory pies, spiced stews thickened with almonds, and bread trenchers used as plates. Honey was the most common sweetener. Saffron, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves flavored the richer dishes, and warm spiced wine was poured from ceramic jugs. But here is a detail that often surprises people. Noble women frequently did not eat in the great hall at all. Social customs of the time made it difficult for a woman to maintain the ideal of neatness and delicacy while eating with her hands in front of a crowd. So the lady of the household, and often her attendants, would dine privately in her own chambers. These were not lonely meals. They were intimate ones, shared among the women of her household, away from the noise and performance of the hall. It was a meal taken in comfort, with conversation, and without the pressure of being watched. The afternoon was where the day softened. After the meal, a princess turned to the work that many medieval women are best remembered for: embroidery. And calling it simply needlework does not do it justice. Medieval embroidery was an art form of extraordinary skill. In England, a tradition called Opus Anglicanum produced some of the finest embroidered textiles in all of Europe, so highly prized that popes and bishops commissioned them for liturgical vestments. Women stitched with silk thread, gold wire, and tiny seed pearls, creating images of saints, vines, flowers, and scripture on fabric that shimmered in candlelight. What makes this even more beautiful is what the work meant to the women doing it. Embroidery was meditative. The repetitive motion of the needle, the slow filling in of color, the focus required to follow an intricate design. Women often sang psalms or prayed aloud while they stitched, turning the act of making into an act of devotion. They worked together in groups, sitting in the solar, the sunlit upper room of the castle that served as a private living space for the women of the household. The conversation that passed between them as they stitched was its own kind of companionship, steady and familiar, the kind that comes from sitting alongside someone day after day, season after season. Alongside embroidery, a princess might spend part of her afternoon reading. Many were literate, educated by tutors at home or in the households of other noble families. Christine de Pizan herself argued passionately that girls should be educated just as boys were, writing that if it were customary to send daughters to school, they would learn just as well. Princesses read devotional texts, histories, poetry, and letters. Some learned to play the harp or the lute. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most celebrated women of the 12th century, became famous for her patronage of troubadour poets and musicians, filling her court with song and verse. Blanche of Castile, who served as regent of France, was known for encouraging religious scholarship and the arts. These were women of intellect and taste, and their afternoons reflected that. If the weather allowed, a walk through the castle garden offered a different kind of pleasure. Medieval walled gardens were enclosed spaces, sheltered from the wind, often planted with roses, lilies, violets, and fruit trees. They were beautiful, and they were also some of the few places where a woman of rank could move with a degree of freedom. Within those stone walls, she could walk at her own pace, sit beneath a tree, or simply stand still in the open air. The garden appears again and again in medieval art and literature as a space associated with women, with peace, and with something very close to joy. If you have been enjoying this quiet walk through history, consider subscribing. There is so much more to discover about the lives of the women who came before us, and these are stories worth hearing. As the afternoon light dimmed, the evening began to settle over the castle. Supper was a simpler meal than dinner, often just bread, cheese, cold meats, and perhaps a little fruit or a warm broth. It was eaten earlier than we eat today, usually in the late afternoon. and it carried a gentler, more restful feeling than the midday meal. Candles were lit, rushlights flickered in their iron holders. The great hall, if the household gathered there, would have been warm with firelight and the low sound of conversation. The hours between supper and sleep were often the most companionable of the day. A princess might listen to music, hear a story told aloud, or simply sit with her ladies in the soft light of the bedchamber, talking over the small events of the day. There were no screens, no distractions beyond the human ones. Just voices, firelight, and the familiar presence of the women who shared her life. The final prayers of the day came at Compline, the last of the canonical hours. It was a moment of stillness, a closing of the circle that had begun at dawn in the chapel. The princess would have said her prayers quietly, perhaps holding that same book of hours she had carried in the morning, its painted pages now lit by the glow of a single candle. And then sleep. The bedchamber, hung with tapestries and layered with wool and linen. The embers in the hearth settling low. The breathing of her ladies nearby. The castle quiet at last. When we look back at these women's lives, we tend to focus on the political marriages, the dangers of childbirth, the lack of freedom, and those things were real. But there is another side of their story that deserves to be told just as carefully. The lavender drying in the still room, the gold thread pulled through silk on a winter afternoon, the scent of rose water on clean linen, the sound of a psalm sung softly while hands worked, the garden in late summer, when the roses were still blooming and the light came through the leaves. Their days were full of skill, full of purpose, and full of connection to the women around them. And if you sit with that for a moment, you might notice something surprising. The things that made their lives feel good, the warmth, the rhythm, the company, the care taken over small and beautiful things, those are the same things that make our lives feel good today. Some things, it turns out, have never really changed.